This is TAZA, a knowledge series brought to you by Alliance for Coffee Excellence and Cup of Excellence.
So what I did is what I like more in my job is digging into data. So Darren gave me the opportunity to dive in the huge database of Cup of Excellence. So we have a database that is representing like 3,176 entries. That's huge. So here in that slide, you just have the breakdown into countries. So we have 15 countries and 15 years. And we have not all the characteristics for all the samples, but as you can see in this figure, we have a significant number of data for all the samples. So it is a huge value in terms of statistics, and that was really so great to go into those data. So the first thing is that fortunately, along the years, the average score of the Cup of Excellence have gone up. And as you can see, there has been a plateau until 2010 at 86.73, and then a jump of 0.68 to another plateau between 2012 and 2015, and then a big jump very recently in the years 2016 and 2017. When we look at it country-wise, I'm not sure. When we look at it country-wise, we can see that all the countries had a statistically significant increase. And to mention some of them, the Brazil Naturals and Costa Rica had a very good increase of 0.2 score, of course, per year. Then we looked at the quality scores and altitude. And as you can see here, there's no major trend. If you look at all the data together, if you compare the altitude in the x-axis and the average of scores in the y-axis. So, but this is expected as we are dealing with a lot of different countries, and all those different countries, they have different average altitudes. What is really interesting is that when we looked at it country-wise, we had a typical triangular shape. So you can see those triangles. I just picked like 3 countries, Costa Rica, Colombia, Burundi. And as you can see, when you are in high altitudes, then you can have scores from, let's say here, 84, 85 to 94. But when you are in lower altitudes, you don't have a lot of probabilities to reach high scores. So this triangular shape is really typical of a necessary but not sufficient relationship. So it is necessary to have altitude to get the highest score, but it is not sufficient. So that, and this is true for all the different countries. As you can see, I just picked 3 of them. If you looked also at the relation between altitude and scores country-wise, you can see also that the trend is quite similar, but we have some countries where we gain more score with altitude. For example, in Burundi, we had a 0.51 increase for each 100 meters altitude, and so on and so forth. You can see the different countries and the different evolution with altitude. And we had also some countries that had not a significant relationship with altitude. Then we had a look at the following. How did each country increase the altitude of the sample or not across years? And again, we had some different patterns, even if the general trend is to go up. But for some countries, there was a really statistically significant relationship. For example, with Costa Rica gaining like 23 meters per year, in Colombia 20 meters, and others were not statistically significant. But there was clearly, in general, a tendency of having samples from higher altitude across years. So what about the relationship between the time, the years, and the bid? So we had, interestingly, we had an increase, but rather smooth, of the median bid. But we had an exponential increase in the maximum bid each year. So we'll come back to that. In fact, we'll come back to that right now. So here, what we can see is if you break down the relation between score and bid year-wise, you can see that in the early years, there was a relationship that was almost linear between score and the bid. But in recent years, it has like skyrocketed, especially in 2016 and 2017. But you can see a trend that each year there was higher and higher high bids for coffees that were at a score greater than 90. And another interesting pattern here, when you look at the relation between bid and score, is that it's not exactly the same for each country. For example, this exponential was super steep for Peru, and Peru was only in 2017, by the way. But here you can see that for the same score, the high bids were quite different for each different country, which might, of course, be in line with the work and be explained by the work of Chad and Peter. Now I'm going to go to the variety types. But before we go to the variety types, I just want to have a quick summary of the variety types that we have. So here I grouped the varieties in the following categories. First of all, we have, of course, the Ethiopian. And then, as you know, the Ethiopian varieties, then there was an introduction into Yemen, where the coffee was domesticated. And then from Yemen, it went to India. And from India, you had the variety Typica. And directly from Yemen, you had the variety Bourbon. Bourbon and Typica, you know all them, that's a group. The Ethiopian are a group. And maybe that what people they know less is that most of the East and Central African varieties, all the SLs, all the Kents, the Jacksons, etc., all of those are coming from India, from the germplasm that went to India from Yemen. So I call those varieties like the SLs and the Kent, the Jacksons and Missouri and everything, the Indian and East African varieties. Just to make it clear, East and Central African varieties are not Bourbon, okay? So some of them might have Bourbon if you have introduced Bourbon, but most of the East and Central African varieties are related to Bourbon or Typica because they all come from Yemen, but they are different from Bourbon and Typica. So that's why I group them in Indian and East Africa. And in the recent days, you have two other groups of varieties. The introgressed are all those varieties that they are descending from the Timor hybrids. And so those are Salchimos, Katimos, etc. And you have the F1 hybrids, which are basically Ethiopian crossed with either an introgressed or a Bourbon Typica variety. So just for us to have this in mind before I go further. So in our sample, the 3,000 and something, we have 81% of Bourbon Typica, 10% of introgressed, 8% of East Africa, and some Ethiopian. So Ethiopian here is mainly Geisha and Java. We have few hybrids. The panorama of the country, all the East African varieties, of course, are in Burundi and Rwanda. You have some East African and SL in El Salvador, noticeable. Then we have the Bourbon typica country, pure Bourbon typica like Bolivia. And we have, like Bolivia, El Salvador, Peru, Costa Rica, and Guatemala are mainly Bourbon typica. But they, as we will see, they are putting some Ethiopian in the Cup of Excellence, and also some hybrids like in Costa Rica and Nicaragua. Mexico, Honduras, Colombia, and Brazil are mostly Bourbon typica with, of course, some introgrest. So now the varieties, types, and the cup score. Well, this chart is very, I mean, I don't need to comment it a lot. The Ethiopian, on average, they are at 89.5 plus, and all the other ones are almost similar. I introduced the yellow. Yellow is not a type of varieties. It can be a yellow Catura, it can be a yellow Catimor, including, but it was interesting to make the difference when it was yellow because we could see some effect in the results. And as you can see, when it is yellow, it is a little bit more in the score. Along the time, so this is really interesting. So you can see here, this graph is along the years, you've got the percentage of each category of variety. And you can see that there is a before and an after, let's say, 2012. After 2012, there was, in the Cup of Excellence competition, there were more and more Ethiopians. So again, Geisha, Java, mostly. There was more yellow. There were most of East Africa, and the hybrid started to show up. And this is true for all the countries, but I would like to highlight two countries where it was really clear. So it is Costa Rica, where you have here, you see, an increase of Ethiopian and East African and of yellow. The Nicaragua also, you have Ethiopian yellow and the hybrid. And you know that for historical reason and stakeholders in Nicaragua, you have more hybrids in Nicaragua. And Brazil, there's no lot of evolution, but I just wanted to show this graph because you can confirm that yes, Brazil has a significant high share of yellow. Now I go to the different varieties. So varieties within the categories, like Pluma Hidalgo, yeah, Bourbon, Chocolate, de Guatemala, etc. So here it is the name of the variety. You can see that it is increasing, but after 2012 also. But the problem is here, well, it's not a problem, but an observation. There's a lot of different names for the same variety, in fact. So we had to really go in all the details to see the varieties that were in fact exactly the same. Here we can see that not all countries are evolving the same in terms of number of varieties. And there are some countries like Guatemala, Costa Rica, Nicaragua that are more active, I would say, in the Cup of Excellence to present more and more varieties, type of varieties each year. Now I tried to make a multivariate analysis. This is a multivariate analysis. Don't be afraid. So I put all together, all the samples together, like in a big cocktail, big mix, and then the multivariate analysis. What it tells us what is the big picture, how the countries are related in terms of scores and attributes. What the first thing you can see in this slide is that it's difficult to see. And when it is difficult to see, it is because it is not very clear. So it is not very clear. There are no marked difference between all the countries. For some reasons, you have Brazil Cup Naturals like clustering with Guatemala, with brown sugar, sweet and cocoa attributes. Of course, you have a tendency of Burundi Rwanda being more floral. You have a tendency of Colombia, Mexico to have more fruity notes. So for a start, it's not bad, but at the time we'll go, I'm sure we will be able to be even more precise in this kind of panorama. What was much clearer is when instead of the countries, we looked at the year. And here there is a really interesting trend. So first of all, for some reason, and I don't know the reason, but it is statistically super clear that 2008 was a different year than the others, with a lot of spicy, floral, etc. It's a fact. But the other fact, which is really interesting, is that we can see a path. We can see that and a tendency from 2013, let's say, to 14, 15, 16, 17, toward this area, which is characterized by berry, citric, and other fruits attributes. So again, it's really clear. I have not the interpretation right now, but my friends, they have from the Cup of Excellence and how you score the cup. But you can see there is a tendency to go towards more berry, citric, other fruits along the last years. So now I'm going close to the end. And the question here is whether there was significant factors for higher scores. In other words, are they winners or losers? The good news is that there's no losers. There's no losers. I mean, you can still get high scores even if you're not in low, if you are in low altitude, if you are using introgress varieties, and if you are in a given countries, you still got the chance you can get very high scores. So there's no losers. Actually, there are some winners, and those are the winners. And let me remind you that this is a very large statistical regression, taking into account everything. So every factor is taken into account. So the big winners, statistically significant and 1 million chance, is the altitude. So whatever the country you are, you can have an increase in the score of 1 every 500 meters. So this is not like absolute truth, but we have seen that it is a necessary but not sufficient conditions. But this is the fact that what the figures are saying. The second big winner is geisha. Wherever you are, whatever the country, if you've got a geisha, then you might expect to have a 2.14 score higher than average other varieties. And the other winners is Pacamara variety, where you have almost +1 in the score if you have a Pacamara. So those are the winners in terms of statistics, right? And I'm pretty sure that in the terms of varieties, as the time goes, and we can see there's a lot of other varieties coming in, when they are well identified, then we can have some SL28 coming in, we can have some Chiroso coming in from Colombia, for example. We can have a lot of new varieties coming in. So what I'm saying here, a lot of you, you're looking at that and say, what? But we knew that. I mean, that's something we could guess. Yes, that's something we could guess. But here, we've got a statistical confirmation with more than 3,000 points, with 15 years and 15 countries. So that's really robust, and we can say we can use that as a reference. So what is the way forward? So be aware that what I just presented is a picture of the Cup of Excellence coffee samples, not national average. It is a picture from the samples that are presenting to the Cup of Excellence. The other way forward is keep on tracking data. That's so interesting. I mean, the only thing I want myself is to know more, to dig even more. For that, I'm sorry to say and to tell also Darren, we will have to standardize the data. I struggled a lot in cleaning the data. Data preparation was a huge part of the work. So we will need to work on that. We can and will dive in country by country. I mean, we can go, imagine what this first database gave us on the international level. Imagine what we can do in each country. And also in the way forward, I would like to insist that we should include better tracking for the post-harvest methods, which was not easy to do. So I didn't present anything on the different post-harvest methods because it was just not possible. And the main takeaway, that will be my last slide. So we had, of course, an impressive increase of scores. And we have a recent exponential relation with price. which will be interesting to look at and to understand and to interpret. There have been a quality surge toward altitude, and for some good reason, because we have seen that definitely more altitude, better quality on average in each country. And the final takeaway is that the varieties you have seen, Geisha and Pacamara, I mean, again, most of you would have guessed to have those two at the end, but it is so clear, the genetic effect is so crystal clear that I'm sure that there will be exotic new varieties in the coming years that will be key in the search of the highest quality, not only for Cup of Excellence, but for the specialty coffee market in general. And with that, I thank you all. And again, and a big help to all my friends that should be listening to this webinar. And again, Darin, Anna, Chad, and Peter, thank you for it. It's great to be part of this team to prepare this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christophe. That was very interesting. And you know, if I was coffee, I would want to be a high altitude Geisha Pacamara. We have some questions coming in, and we'll take some time right now, 5 to 10 minutes to answer questions, and then Darren will talk about give an update on Cup of Excellence. So please go ahead and send in questions. We'll get to the ones we have now. Christophe, any data feedback on how processing affects cup over time on average?
So that's a very good question, and I think this question was maybe sent while I was taking before one of my last slides. Actually, as it is now, it is not possible to track the effect of the post-harvest. And this is something we really need to improve, and most of all by standardizing the way we call each way to process, each way to dry, because you know in different countries, different names, different. So it was really not reasonable from a statistical point of view to try to address that. But that's definitely something that is we need to do in the future.
Thank you. And we have another question from Chloe. What do we make of coffees of lower altitudes, less than 1,000 meters, scoring 85 points in Ecuador, for instance? Is that potentially due to microclimates or different varietals?
Okay, so as you have seen, we have general trends, and statistics are showing main trends. But there might be some specific effects in different regions. So I insist that if it is true and statistically it is not arguable that there is a positive effect of altitude, it does not mean that you will not have a great coffee in a lower altitude. First, it depends on which country. I mean, 1,000 meters in Brazil is not the same of 1,000 meters in Nicaragua. So you need to know in which country you are, and yeah, maybe you need to be even more imaginative to play with the post-harvest, to play with the varietals, to get a higher score when you are in a lower altitude.
All right, great, thank you. We have one here for Peter. How can the guide account for a cash premium paid directly to the farmer, not the exporter, over FOB at a time other than export?
Yeah, so that's a great question. One of the things that we talked about at the annual meeting when we brought data donors together was doing a better job of not, again, focusing on the middle of the distribution, but also the difference between minimum and maximum. And so what might happen in certain things is somebody might say, hey, one of the reasons why this FOB price, shelved a little lower than others is because there were other things that were part of our relationship, a subsequent payment or maybe some other in-kind services. One of the things we'd like to do over the next several years with the help of partners on the ground, but also data donors, is to dig into some of those differences. And so if we find out certain prices that are relatively high, cluster around the middle, relatively low, and try to document what some of these other, not just quality, not just size that contributes to FOB prices, but some of the other sort of ancillary inputs. And that's something that we'll be trying to work on kind of over time. I also wanted to say something really quick to Christophe, because we also collect from our data donors information on varieties and information on processing. And I will echo your call for standardization in terms of how we call these things, because it will be fun. But I also want to thank, and I'm very excited about coming together with COE, because some of these drivers of quality and drivers of price that we see in the competition, it's critical for us to see the extent to which they also kind of transmit outside the competitions. So having COE as a data donor, having the kind of work that Christophe's doing in terms of leading the way, I think we might be able to use the transaction guide data to sort of talk about what some of these relationships look like outside the competitions. So anyway, so I just thought I'd throw that in sort of as an add one.
Thank you. We also have another question. This is probably one for you, Peter. How about countries buying the coffees? Any trends across years?
We only have 3 harvest years so far. And we have, the trends across years are, of course, one of the dominant drivers of year-to-year movements over the last 3 years has been sort of the relative decline of the C price. But as kind of we add years, we'll have a chance to kind of look at kind of, what things other than, there's the C price, there's the C price orientation, there's country-to-country differences. Chad's working really, really hard to kind of look at, where our data are relatively flush and where our data are relatively sparse. And so before we get into having really solid things to say about cross-country comparisons, I want to make sure that the data that we're pulling out of Kenya, right, is every bit as thick and representative as the data that we're pulling out of Colombia or Guatemala or El Salvador. And so we have a bit of work to do, but we certainly aspire to be able to address those kinds of questions.
Thanks. And I got one for Christophe. Is there any trend studies for other coffee varieties like Arara?
Arar. So Arar is an Ethiopian, right? Variety. If it is Arar, because sometimes you have the name Arar and the coffee is not exactly Arar, so you need to check sometime. Some specific ongoing quality study on Arar, I'm not aware of. What I am really aware of is the work of WCR on the International Multi-Location Variety Trial. And there are some 30 varieties in that trial. And with a very powerful design that will allow to study the genetic by environment interaction of all those varieties across the world. And I think I'm not sure anymore, but I'm pretty sure that they are doing that, and I think in collaboration with SCA. And that will be a huge and a very interesting work.
Thank you. And we got a question here from John Moore. What metrics are you using? This one anyone can answer it. I'm sending it out to all panelists. What metrics are you using to create the country by country equivalent of a differential? You mentioned cost of production, but that can be radically different regionally within a country. How to capture this complexity in the model? Is cost of production the only contributing factor?
Well, I'll start. I have a very strong desire to both look at, and this is consistent with some of the stuff that Christophe's talking about, there are going to be market drivers of prices, demand side drivers, and there are going to be cost side drivers of prices. And there's going to be things in between that sort of describe sort of the power imbalances and information imbalances between buyers and sellers. I think that's a great question and should be tagged up there as sort of the broader motivational piece. If we can develop a very broad consensus that's shared between buyers and sellers of the things that tend to be more and less valued in different places. And I don't believe necessarily, if you look at some of the stuff that Christophe and the Cup of Excellence looks at, there's not a lot of sort of cost plus pricing kind of going on. in that model. In our world, I believe you're going to see certain places where you will have underlying cost as a very strong driver of the price that we arrive at. But I think that the buyers and sellers in a highly differentiated market sort of are owed a more robust account of the different things that drive prices in different markets. And one of the reasons that all the data donors that work with us, we get together and decide, in addition to the core data, lot size and quality and FOB price and regions, can we collect systematic data on other information? And that's where the varietals and the processing comes in. The mode of contracting, was a fixed versus a differential price? Was the coffee certified? If so, by which one? So all those things will kind of go up and hopefully develop a more robust model. And then as we communicate some of the findings out, again, their inputs into subsequent price discussions. They don't tell somebody what is, they just inform people about the kind of things that the market seems to be valuing.
Yeah, I would just add, in case, John, you're referring to the chart or the table in the guide that relates to how different countries are getting different prices for their coffee. I just want to be clear that what that chart represents is the difference in price being traded in each of these countries that produce coffee based solely on geography. So what Peter did is he eliminated the variable of quality and quantity. So in that chart in the guide that relates to differentials, as we would talk about them in the coffee trade, is only looking at geography's influence on those prices traded once we eliminate quality and quantity. Now, I could go on and on as to why the cost of production should not be our metric for whether something is good or bad. And I'll just say quickly, the cost of production historically in our industry has been leveraged to set minimum prices, leveraged to test the bottom of the market. And I don't think that in a specialty differentiated sector, we want to be talking about the bottom or a minimum price. I think the cost of production factors in terms of allowing producers to make their own decisions on how they sell their coffee and how efficiently they can work their coffee. But I just feel a lot of caution around using the cost of production to say whether something is right or wrong or good or bad.
Thanks, Chad. So we have a whole bunch of great questions that are coming in now. We're going to answer one more, and then we will get back to everyone that has answered a question. It might be just via, we'll send you a message later. So this question is going to go to Darren, and he'll take it. It's a good transition for him to talk about the Cup of Excellence program. So I was wondering which countries were buying Cup of Excellence coffees.
Well, the primary clients, customers, members of the organization, the vast majority by country, Japan is really the leader and has been for many years. South Korea is another large buyer of Cup of Excellence coffees, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and slowly emerging but steady is China. So obviously you see a trend there in terms of Asia, and Australia, it would be fairly close behind those other countries. And Australia historically has been involved for quite a long time too. So that would be the largest percentage, if that answers that question. So, but certainly we have buyers in many countries, and a membership base around 34 different countries and emerging countries. And some of the emerging buyers are coming from Eastern Europe and countries like Thailand, where we see a lot of internal consumption of specialty coffee. So it's starting to kind of fan out into different areas, and certainly the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Oman. So yeah.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. And we'll get started on, we'll wrap up with Darren, and he's going to give an update on Cup of Excellence.
Great. Well, I just want to first thank Chad and Peter and Christophe for putting together some really amazing information. I really value your expertise and your willingness to share. And I think I can tell from all of the questions and chats and QAs that there's been a lot of great questions and really good response. So so thank you very much. Thank you. I did want to just do a quick update on what is currently happening with the Cup of Excellence program. The first thing that's in our sights right now is wrapping up the Ethiopia competition. The national phase, which has been modified and redone, just completed last week. We had to actually completely change the process after the pre-selection of over 1,400 coffees in Ethiopia. We were sent 148 of the top lots here in Portland, where we did a individualized cupping set process, which was vetted by Paul Songer and by Aaron Wang to make sure that we had a panelist group that would be safely cupping using their own individualized sets, socially distanced in our lab, to be able to move the process to the top 40, which the top 40 have just been announced and have been put on our partners' site in Ethiopia, Feed the Future. The Value Chain Activity Group, funded and worked and in cooperation with USAID, have just announced the winners, and we'll be putting that information out. And the next phase of that is we will have our head judges around the world receiving the samples roasted by John Thompson, who's in Ireland, and who will roast the sample sets of the top 40 for all of the judges. We'll have a jury pool here in Portland, and then we have our super jury around the world that will then do the final results, which now means that our auction has been slightly delayed to June 25th. The Cup of Excellence auction will go on, and the national winners, the copies that didn't qualify for COE but scored 86 and higher, 86 to 86.99, will move on to June 22nd through the 26th. There'll be a 5-day auction for those lots as well. And the other news is that, of course, in our Central America competitions, we've had to obviously cancel the international jury, those jurists coming from all over the world to the host country. And we're doing a modified program this year for our Central American countries, where we will have green coffee centers, GCC centers, where we have some of our leading jurists around the world that will cup in their labs independently in 6 different areas around the world to establish the international phase as we work with our partners on the ground. Unfortunately, we've had a couple cancellations due to just on the ground situations with Mexico and Honduras. So we've rescheduled for 2021 for next year. And we're moving forward with our other Central American countries in this modified way to be able to ensure that we back our farmers, that we move the auctions forward, and continue to work our way through this difficult process. But so far, we've had incredible cooperation and partnerships with all of the organizations that we partner with, not only in Central America and Mexico, but also into South America, as we see the program move out into the fall, and in Colombia and Brazil, and working towards Ecuador, working towards Indonesia in 2021. So